Hey everybody, Professor Benlow here with the second of two short videos explaining Unit 4 discussion board. The first topic is Reaganomics that you can delve into. Reagan, when he was sworn into office in January 1981, he wanted basically to free this economy from the slow economic growth and inflation it had been suffering through the presidencies of Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. He wanted to provide every American with extra spending money in their pockets. So he put a program together, an economic program together that was dubbed Reaganomics by the press. And basically, the cornerstone of Reaganomics is the belief that if you cut taxes for the wealthy, the wealth will trickle down to the lower and middle classes. So, really, to gauge the success of Reaganomics, you have to look at how the lower and middle classes fared during that time. Reagan was very much a big fan of smaller government, so he felt that the middle class would be benefited by simpler tax codes. He cut about $41 billion from the federal budget, much of that being funds for social programs. Supply side economics is a big factor in Reaganomics. Basically, supply side economics is the belief that if you cut taxes for big businesses, then the wealth will trickle down. Okay, the Tax Equity and Responsibility Act. The primary document for Reaganomics is Reagan's interview upon signing this bill into law. So the Tax Equity and Responsibility Act of 1982 closed the tax loopholes and restricted benefits in pension plans. This was Reagan's way of dealing with the rising national debt without having to raise taxes. It helped out somewhat, but not as much as hoped. The gap between the rich and the poor continued to grow during Reagan's 8 years in office. He never raised minimum wage while he was president, and federal funding for things like firefighters, policemen, and education were all cut during Reagan's 8 years in office. Single mother and African American households saw the biggest decline in income. 1984, Reagan further slashed tax rates for the wealthy, causing an even larger federal deficit. And the federal deficit would really grow during his second term of office because he was very focused on funding the military and particularly his beloved Star Wars program. Okay, the next topic you can get into is the first Gulf War. The primary document you're going to be analyzing for this topic is President George H.W. Bush's speech regarding Iraqi aggression before the United Nations General Assembly. It was given October 1st, 1990. Okay, so little background on the first Gulf War. August 2nd, 1990, Iraqi forces invaded and took over the nation of Kuwait. Kuwait is a very oil-rich nation. President George H.W. Bush immediately condemned the takeover of Kuwait by the Iraqis and demanded the withdrawal of Iraqi forces. We keep in mind, my dear students, that the United States was the head of United Nations coalition forces in the first Gulf War. And we were based in Saudi Arabia. The coalition forces were based in Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia was more than happy to have the coalition forces based within their country because they are also a very oil-rich nation. And the Saudis basically figured, well, heck, if the Iraqis are taking over Kuwait, we'll be next. So anyway, so basically we got involved to drive the Iraqis out of Kuwait, give the Kuwait back to the Kuwaitis, and basically help out our two oil-rich allies, okay? Since the U.S. had previously been an ally of Iraq, Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein felt that the U.S. would not intervene if he invaded Kuwait. He underestimated President Bush in particular. Coalition forces quickly liberated Kuwait and headed into Iraq. Even though the coalition forces won the war, Saddam Hussein would remain in power until 2003. So, primary document you're going to be analyzing is the speech that President George H.W. Bush gave before the United Nations General Assembly October 1st, 1990. This speech occurred October 1st, 1990, which was a mere 2 months after the Iraqi invasion takeover of Kuwait. Bush absolutely condemned the Iraqi aggression and the Iraqi invasion takeover of Kuwait, and he called on the members of the United Nations to demand a return of Kuwait to the Kuwaitis. He said that the United Nations could aid nations to band together to prevent aggression and punish those responsible. Okay, the last topic that you can cover in the Unit 4 discussion board is the Tear Down This Wall speech. This is a very famous speech that Ronald Reagan gave in front of the Berlin Wall, June 12, 1987. During this speech, he condemned the communist nations. Basically, he urged an end to the Cold War, and he stated his dream of democracy spreading to those nations that had formerly been under communist rule. And he emphasized the hardships that East Germans, particularly East Berliners, had endured since the wall had been built in 1961. The dismantling of the wall actually began 2 years later, a little over 2 years later, November 1989, when the communist East German government collapsed. The economy of the East German government was on the decline for quite some time. Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev urged the East German government to impose economic reforms like he had done in the Soviet Union. Many East Germans were flocking to embassies wanting to be let into West Germany. November 1989, East German leader Erich Honecker resigned, and East Germans were allowed into West Germany. It was a big moment in world history. Okay, so that is basically my explanation of the topics you can cover in Unit 4 discussion board. Again, there are tons of research information out on any of these three topics. Read the primary document, look at what was going on at that time, decide which topic interests you the most, and dive into it. And please don't hesitate to ask me any questions. Basically, good luck and enjoy delving into these topics. Have a good